Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I guess I should probably begin, too, in some allusion to yesterday, in saying that, in a sense, when an academic, and particularly one who lives in the cloistered space that we live in here, talks on contemporary politics, I think one does so knowing that one has a special privilege and a detachment, and perhaps even a remoteness from the responsibilities that are those who lead us. And I think in that sense, it's perhaps a particularly unfortunate afternoon to be talking about President Obama's legacy in a way that's in any way critical. And I think my assessment today will be, I hope, balanced, and I'll give you a sense of some of the things I think have gone better and some that have gone worse. But that sense of responsibility, I mean, without accepting Boris Johnson's suggestion that we're corduroy-jacketed academics, I think it is important that one recognizes one's privilege in being a commentator rather than a participant. I should start with another caveat as well, which is, as a good rule of thumb, I think you should be suspicious of any historian who claims to be an expert guide to the present. Most of us read the newspapers, but that's also true for most of you. And I think it's easy to fall into the trap of imagining that your awareness of historical context gives you some access to hidden truths about the present. So I'm delighted and honored to have the chance to deliver this year's Milestones lecture, but perhaps I should start by confessing, this will become evident, that I'm not an expert in every detail of the Obama presidency. In fact, I work mostly on 18th and 19th century American history, so I'm not really an expert on 20th century, let alone 21st century American politics and history. But I am very interested in the American contemporary scene. Let me lay out some qualifications. I lived in the US for the best part of a decade. I got there during the administration of Bill Clinton. I was there for a great deal of the administration of George W. Bush, and I spent a year in California, which is perhaps not the most representative part of America, but a year in California during Obama's first term. And I think that I probably have George W. Bush to thank for being back here in Cambridge. He doesn't select every faculty position, not in the history faculty at least, but George W. Bush is the person whose reign in the US persuaded my wife that she could never allow me to work forever in American academia. So it was the experience of kind of living during Bush time, as it became known, that pushed my wife over the edge, led me back here initially to York and now to Cambridge. And I mentioned that not entirely spuriously, because the key thing to remember, I think, about Barack Obama's political rise was that he was very much a product of the George W. Bush years, 8 long years in which Democrats in the United States began to feel increasingly desperate. And one of the few highlights the Democrats felt during a particularly depressing year, which was 2004. That was the year in which they failed to regain the White House with John Kerry's campaign. They failed to regain the Senate or the House of Representatives. So we'd had all of the Iraq War at that point, and it seemed to be beginning to turn bad, and yet the Democrats couldn't make any inroads at all in that year. But one of the few highlights was the speech of a young US Senate candidate from Illinois, not even a senator yet, a candidate for the US Senate from Illinois named Barack Obama at the Democratic Party convention in Boston. Here he is. I couldn't resist doing this. I know this is incredibly Daily Mail, and I do mean that pejoratively. It's like the sidebar of shame, isn't it? Obama then and now. Okay, so that's very, very depressing. That's what power does to you. But what I want to do first of all today, I have the plan to show you a few clips during my talk. I'm hoping this is going to work out. If it doesn't, I don't know what we're going to do. Let's just assume it will work. But what I want to do first of all is show you a tiny little excerpt from that 2004 speech, which kind of made Obama's name. So I'll cross over here and I'll see if I can play it for you.
It is that fundamental belief,
you know what?
I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, that makes this country work. It's what allows us to pursue our individual dreams and yet still come together as one American family. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Now, even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America. The pundits like to slice and dice our country into red states and blue states, red states for Republicans, blue states for Democrats. But I've got news for them too. We worship an awesome God in the blue states, and we don't like federal agents poking around in our libraries in the red states. We coach Little League in the blue states, and yes, we've got some gay friends in the red states. There are patriots who opposed the war in Iraq, and there are patriots who supported the war in Iraq. We are one people, all of us pledging allegiance to the Stars and Stripes, all of us defending the United States of America.
All right. Okay, so that's 2004. Obama's meteoric rise really begins there. He won the Senate seat. And then 4 years later, you remember that he ran a campaign for the presidency, which to begin with at least seemed outlandish. Most people were sure that Hillary Clinton would win the primary race for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. But Hillary struggled with a few things. I'm happy to get into this later, although I'm even less reliable in prognosticating than describing the present, I think. The three things that I think held Hillary back. First, I think she wasn't a natural orator, or rather Barack Obama's incredible skills made her in 2008 seem that she wasn't a natural orator. I think she was held back in many ways by her association with the 1990s. Bill Clinton remained pretty popular with Democrats throughout the 2000s. He's still very popular now. But she seemed like a candidate who somehow referred to the past, and Obama's youth and Obama's rhetoric absolutely seemed to root the US in the future. And I think she also struggled in a big way because the political culture in the United States was not welcoming, and I think still isn't incredibly welcoming to female candidates, especially for the highest office. I think that really became apparent in the 2008 campaign. Okay, but getting back to Obama, he ruthlessly identified what he took to be Hillary's weakness, which is that Hillary Clinton could not be the change candidate. And you will remember from 2008 some of the taglines of Obama's campaign, which would never have worked, I think, for Hillary. There's this one, which you'll recognize. This one. And this may be the most famous. Okay, well, that is incredibly footage from the election night in 2008, but the incredible part is it's from the East Village. Now, I lived in Manhattan for a year. If anyone's ever lived in or been to the East Village, the idea that the people who lived there, who were way to the left of Jeremy Corbyn, would see Barack Obama, a mainstream Democrat, as this person you go into the streets to chant for, really gives you some sense of what he'd been able to achieve. And particularly the way that he'd been able to bring so many people into his coalition, including people that I think are pretty hard left, the kind of people that would not come into the streets for any other politician before and not since. So in 2008, Barack Obama found a brilliant way to tap into his own supposed unlikeliness as a candidate to prove that other changes were possible. If a black man could become president in the United States, he told audiences, there was nothing about the country that couldn't be fixed. There was nothing that couldn't change. And this is a message that ran throughout the campaign. It came to a climax at the Democratic National Convention, which took place in August of 2008 in Denver, Colorado. This was not the first time the Democrats had gathered in Denver, Colorado to have their convention. They did so in 1908, when this gentleman, William Jennings Bryan, accepted a nomination. Although, if you want a sense of how American politics has changed, he didn't even go to Denver. He actually just hung out in Nebraska at his house, and he followed the proceedings of the convention via telegraph. And then when he found out he'd won, he invited some friends over for a plate of watermelon. So things are different now. 100 years on, American politics worked in a very different way. Now, this is perhaps the only piece of expertise I can actually offer you. I was actually at the Democratic Convention and the Republican Convention in 2008, covering the conventions for a magazine, with a brief to write about what happened during those conventions. So I got to see the speakers with my press pass at relatively close quarters all week. And then on the final night, I had a seat in the press box here. Spectacular location. This is Mile High Stadium. Invesco Field. All American stadium, of course, have to have a corporate sponsor. So Invesco Field, just outside of Denver. And this is where Barack Obama moved the Democratic National Convention to for its final night. It had been in a 20,000-seat basketball arena, and then it moved to the 72,000-seat American football stadium. This cost a lot of money. It actually cost $6 million. And there was lots of criticism of the set design, particularly this, which had been erected behind Obama. Conspiracy theorists and cultural critics are still trying to figure out exactly what this is supposed to represent. Is it Greek liberty? Is it some sort of veiled reference to the Illinois State House, which looks rather similar? Or is it the White House? Many people pointed out that the shape of these windows appeared to suggest that Obama had already made it to the White House. Conservative critics called this the Temple of Obama. There were plenty of illustrations of this kind to suggest that the candidate had overreached. But the staging gave Obama an astonishing setting from which to make his pitch to the American people. And his speech that night was called The American Promise. And it developed a theme that he'd worked on throughout his campaign. Now, on some level, of course, Barack Obama was the American promise. He himself was that promise. He was proof that the nation could withstand and even champion enormous changes. The son of a foreign student from Kenya and a white mother, a child with roots in Africa who'd lived in Hawaii and in Indonesia, and an electrifying politician who had come from nowhere in just 4 years to challenge seriously for the nation's highest office. So I think the best example of the American promise that evening was him. But clearly he also wanted to define the promise in words and policies. So he got his speechwriter to try and put this into some kind of, sentences, or 2 or 3 sentences, probably more like a paragraph. And I actually won't play you that paragraph, but I will tell you a bit about it. It was the most mundane thing that Barack Obama had said for weeks, maybe months. He argued that America was built around free enterprise, but there was still a role for government, that Americans should strive to improve their own lives and the lives of their families, but that they shouldn't lose sight of the needs of others. Now, I think that rhetoric may have seemed appealing that night because of the excesses of the George W. Bush years, but it was so middle of the road. I think it could have been said by any Democratic candidate for the past few decades, and even by many Republican candidates. But the part of the speech that only Barack Obama could have delivered, I think, was the final section. Now, I think, again, many of you will probably remember this, but we're going to take a minute or two just to watch it again now.
This country of ours has more wealth than any nation, but that's not what makes us rich. We have the most powerful military on earth, but that's not what makes us strong. Our universities and our culture are the envy of the world, but that's not what keeps the world coming to our shores. Instead, it is that American spirit, that American promise, that pushes us forward, even when the path is uncertain, that binds us together in spite of our differences, that makes us fix our eye not on what is seen, but what is unseen, that better place around the bend. That promise is our greatest inheritance. It's a promise I make to my daughters when I tuck them in at night, and a promise that you make to yours. A promise that has led immigrants to cross oceans and pioneers to travel west. A promise that led workers to picket lines and women to reach for the ballot. And it is that promise that 45 years ago today brought Americans from every corner of this land to stand together on a mall in Washington before Lincoln's memorial and hear a young preacher from Georgia speak of his dream. The men and women who gathered there could have heard many things. They could have heard words of anger and discord. They could have been told to succumb to the fear and frustrations of so many dreams deferred. But what the people heard instead, people of every creed and color, from every walk of life, is that in America, our destiny is inextricably linked. That together, our dreams can be won. We cannot walk alone, the preacher cried. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. America, we cannot turn back. Not with so much work to be done, not with so many children to educate and so many veterans to care for, not with an economy to fix and cities to rebuild and farms to save, not with so many families to protect and so many lives to mend. America, we cannot turn back. We cannot walk alone. At this moment, in this election, we must pledge once more to march into the future. Let us keep that promise, that American promise, and in the words of Scripture, hold firmly, without wavering, to the hope that we confess. Thank you. God bless you. And God bless the United States of America.
Okay, what I think Barack Obama did there, I mean, it's an extraordinary speech, but what I think he did was to try to bring together two, we could call them rhetorical or political traditions in American history. And I want to talk about them for a second because I think they're very important to our assessing what happened when he became president. The first of those is what we might call the black protest tradition, the fusion of religious and political enthusiasm and sentiment that was most memorably deployed by that preacher from Georgia. It's incredible that he didn't mention Martin Luther King, but that, of course, is who we're talking about. The other tradition is what we might call the exceptionalist tradition, the idea that America isn't really like other countries, and that's what makes it so hopeful and so great. I won't get into this in too much detail, but Martin Luther King himself had a very interesting relationship with that exceptionalist tradition in his own speeches. He was brilliant at playing back to the American people the contradictions between their lofty rhetoric of liberty and equality and the ongoing problems of racial and eventually economic injustice. But when Martin Luther King tapped into that black protest tradition, it was clear that he was speaking for and about black people. You don't doubt when you hear him say we, that the we he's referring to is a rallying cry for African Americans. And I just want to share, I mean, it's unfair, but I want to share a bit of Martin Luther King in precisely this mode with you right now. One of the best examples of this kind of playing with, like a cat playing with this exceptionalist tradition by Martin Luther King, came in that astonishing speech that he delivered in Memphis in April of 1968, just before his death, the night before his assassination. I think it's worth comparing these two speeches and styles because Obama did so much in 2008 to tap into this legacy of Dr. King.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, We aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
There's not a lot you can say after that. It seems mundane to observe that when he talks about we as a people, he's referring to African Americans. And when he invokes America, he is speaking to America, to white America in particular, not for white America. And I think the allure of Barack Obama back in 2008 was that he seemed to be able to access this black protest tradition and to offer some of its electrifying energy, some of its moral purpose to everybody. The we in Obama's speeches no longer referred to African Americans, but to all Americans. And I think that's a huge shift. Now we're going to come on now to talk about some of the stuff that Barack Obama faced in his way. Before I do though, one last thing I want to say about Martin Luther King. I don't think that Barack Obama, by appropriating some of Dr. King's cadences and some of his language, some of his rhetoric, some of these kinds of dynamics of his speeching, meant this in any way as a rebuke or as a denial of the racial problems that continued in the United States. But many people in the media assume that the election of Barack Obama confirmed that the United States was moving towards being a post-racial society. That was a phrase one saw a great deal in the campaign of 2008 and in early 2009. Now, I've got mixed feelings then about the ways in which Barack Obama had used Martin Luther King. I think had he been a white politician, this would have been impossible. It would have landed him in a whole lot of trouble. But Obama's race has always played a really important role in the public's perception of him, in his appeal, as well as in those people who are still motivated by racism, I'm going to come on to in a second. Any assessment of his presidency has to start with an acknowledgement of the fact that race is one of the most important filters through which his promise has been seen, imagined, understood. Okay, well, let's talk about this racist side to the American public after Obama's election and even before it. A very sizable minority of American voters have found it hard to detach themselves from their prejudices and accept a black man as president of the United States. There's been a small amount, relatively speaking, of what I'd call explicit and overt racism towards Obama. But I think there's been a much larger amount of toxic implication and innuendo, particularly from the far right, which tries to deny Obama's citizenship, as you can see here, where's the birth certificate, or to suggest that he might be, especially because his middle name is Hussein, some kind of secret Muslim. Right now, the leading Republican candidate for 2016 is Donald Trump, the man my daughter said the other morning at breakfast looked like he had just been electrocuted. Donald Trump gave enormous support to the so-called birther movement. The birthers were the people that wanted to see the birth certificate of Barack Obama. This conservative effort to try to say the president was born in Kenya or somewhere else that would disqualify him from the presidency. And then as a candidate running behind Trump, the African-American surgeon Ben Carson, who made the extraordinary claim last month that a Muslim should never be allowed to become president of the United States. Now, I don't think there's any doubt that this was Carson's way of acknowledging the obsession of some people on the far right with Barack Obama's alienness, which I fear has become a channel for a deep and abiding racism in American society. So let's acknowledge all of that, because that's a crucial foundation for the way in which race worked in Obama's presidency. But I think we also need to acknowledge the ways in which Obama himself has used race to shape the narrative, as the spin doctors say. I haven't said much so far about Obama's backstory, his roots in Kenya, rather than in America, the United States, particularly the kind of black tradition that dates back to slavery in the United States. I haven't said anything about his early career as a community organizer in Chicago, but I think it's not unfair to say that his candidacy was built around another curious disconnect. Barack Obama was happy to seem like the heir of Martin Luther King, as the vindication of what he called the American promise. But he was also extremely keen to avoid saying anything that would seem to align him with a black perspective or with the black community, or to dwell on the unresolved tensions in American racial history. I'm not going to say too much more about that now, but the Black Lives Matter movement, Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, the extraordinary cascade of civil rights protests and infractions in the past year or two, I think Obama has seemed curiously not part of that. That's gone on, and in a way it's sort of directed Obama back towards something that he didn't want to do, which is delve into this tangled, terrible history of race in America. Okay, so in many ways I think that Obama's brilliant self-fashioning on the subject of race is an example of what a terrific politician he was and perhaps still is. But I also think that it created a reservoir of excitement and investment, particularly by Americans who are more on the liberal end of the spectrum. And this has resulted in a very strong, even profound sense of disillusionment that Obama hasn't been able to translate his symbolic omnipotence into radical change. And that idea that Obama is the master of symbolism, but actually in practical terms has found it very, very hard to achieve concrete things. It's kind of a big theme of what's happened in the last 7 years. Okay, so this is a good moment for me to move on to dig a little more closely into the detail. I don't want to barrage you with a description or an assessment of everything that's happened during the Obama administration, but maybe I can flag up a few key areas. On the economy, you'll remember that Obama took office back in 2009 in the midst of a terrible financial crisis. I think it's striking that his approach to that was very different from the one that was adopted here in Britain in 2010, whereas we went the austerity route, Barack Obama went the stimulus route. Now, it's true that the effect of that stimulus spending by the federal government was mitigated by the fact you have all these state governments in the US, and they tended to go the other way. So they tended to go in the austerity direction. So there was a kind of balancing out there. And that's an important break, perhaps, on what Obama could achieve with the stimulus package. We could talk more about some of the deep problems inherent in the American political system, not just in terms of Congress and gridlock, which we'll come on to, but also in terms of the federal government and the states, which I think do create some problems for anyone who's trying to affect change. But I think Obama deserves some credit for picking up the pieces after the disasters financially in 2007 and 2008. You can see here that his policies did finally make a difference or contribute to the reduction in the unemployment rate, which is clearly very welcome. But there are still some stubborn indicators which haven't been changing in the direction we'd like to see. I'll just share a couple with you. Here's the poverty rate since 1990. You can see that it's been incredibly hard for Obama to make very much of an impact on that. Let me share a couple more. Child poverty. This has actually gone back up, which is pretty grim. And then, again, extraordinary, astonishing statistics on the breakdown of poverty here by race. And again, if you want some insight into this disconnect almost between the reality of racial injustice in America and this soaring kind of post-racial rhetoric, I think these figures supply that in large amounts. Okay, so another major concern since 2008, which is actually becoming a big part of the campaign narrative this year, is income inequality. And again, this is something that Barack Obama has really found it impossible to make an impact on. There are lots of different ways of measuring this. Here you've got historical inequality. It's kind of unnerving to me to see we're so much higher than the 1920s. This line in the middle here is the average for all of the US states. And this is broken down to show you the lowest inequality state and the highest. So there's least inequality in Alaska, and there's most here in Connecticut. But this is the percentage of total incomes that go to the top 10%. So you can see it's in Connecticut more than 60% going to the top 10%. Let's go to the top 1%. And again, you can see some extraordinary figures. And you can also see a historical trend here, which clearly Obama has not been able to get his hands around and change. So it would be fair to say that Obama may have had very strong liberal instincts in his economic policy, but he has certainly not been able, should we say, to change the paradigm. And I only mention that because if it's ever going to be possible in American history to change a paradigm, it tends to be the case it happens in moments of crisis. Maybe that's true for all histories, but certainly for American history. So one thinks about the New Deal in relation to the Great Depression, or you think about the policies that emerged after World War II, or you think about the crisis of the 60s. These are moments where crises, economic, political, and social took place, and there were radical changes. I'm not sure we've necessarily seen those after the crisis of 2007, 2008, despite the fact that a man is committed to change you can believe in, as Barack Obama was in the White House. Okay, so no change in the paradigm economically, I think. You can probably say the same thing for immigration. Back in 2009, it seemed as if the Republican Party might be ready to accept a new paradigm in immigration thinking. In particular, there are around 11 million undocumented immigrants, the vast majority of them Latinos, in the United States. Because Republicans weren't winning elections back then, the entire House, Congress, Senate, House, and Presidency had gone to the Democrats. There was a thought that Republicans would have to reach out to the Latino demographic. And one way to do that might be to take a less hardline stance on immigration. Some Republicans were willing to consider plans that didn't look like Donald Trump's plan, which he's just announced, which is that you just kick out 11 million people and build a very large wall. That was not the mood in the Republican Party, or certainly not in the liberal wings of it back in 2009. But I'm afraid that immigration issue has also been lost in congressional gridlock, with one exception, which I'll come back to in a second. The same congressional gridlock, the same problems and difficulties of getting things done, that's befallen Obama's plan to spend tens of billions of dollars renewing America's infrastructure, which is in a terrible state. Bridges falling down, I mean, all kinds of difficult problems that the federal government has found it very hard to get involved in. And I think that this issue, or this problem of issues that end up not being resolved, or paradigms that don't get shifted, has also been an issue for most of Barack Obama's presidency on the subject of climate change. Though I do want to say one or two things about this, because I think this is particularly interesting. This year, finally, after more than 6 years, in which Barack Obama hoped that Congress would hold the key, working with Congress on climate change would hold the key to changing the paradigm, he's actually decided that he is going to try to take action, should we say, unilaterally. So I believe that Barack Obama is absolutely sincere in recognizing that anthropogenic climate change is a huge danger, not just to the United States, but to the world. I think that some of the disasters, Hurricane Katrina, the superstorm, Sandy, various other events that have happened in the past few years have focused the mind of the president, at least, on the need to act. But as you know, many people in the US don't agree with the president and with the scientific community. In fact, virtually every Republican candidate for 2016 does not share the view that climate change is a scientific fact. So this year, after nearly 7 years of struggling to make headway, Obama has started to explore other avenues to Congress for curbing emissions of carbon. One of these was the announcement this summer of new emissions standards. So climate change plan that Barack Obama could introduce because it comes through the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a bit of the federal government that the president has big control over. So rather than trying to pass bills through Congress telling power stations that they have to be cleaner and making states and businesses accept that you need to shift to cleaner energy, Barack Obama has used the existing regulatory structure that he in effect can control through his appointees to try to make that change. It will be terrific if that works out. That's still going to face many legal challenges, I think. Another thing he's done recently, you may have read in the papers, is finally reject the plan to build this pipeline from the tar sands up in Alberta, Canada, down into the US pipeline network that would enable the Canadians to sell their tar sand oil much, much, much more cheaply into the major markets in the Gulf. So finally Obama has come out and said, just last week or the week before, that shouldn't happen, which again is welcome if you believe the science on this. And there's about to be the massive UN climate change conference. I don't know if it's going to be in Paris anymore. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't. But it's supposed to take place at the end of this month. And again, for those of you that aren't up to speed on this, this is potentially the final opportunity we're going to have to put in place a new climate change framework internationally to replace the Kyoto Protocol, which was drafted in the late 1990s and expires in 2020. So all of the countries of the world are sending representatives. Barack Obama, at least before yesterday, was planning to be in Paris in person. I'm sure he'll still be wherever that climate change conference is held. It's probably going to be in Paris, I'm guessing. I mean, they won't want to move it if they can show their commitment to standing by France. So it might be worth keeping an eye on this one. If Barack Obama does sign whatever comes through, there's still going to be a problem, which is Bill Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol back in 1998, and Congress wouldn't ratify it. So if Barack Obama signs whatever comes out of this meeting in Paris, there may still be an issue with the US not accepting it. The US has never signed the Kyoto Protocol. Again, the exceptional nation, right? They have never signed the protocol that guides the carbon emissions of most of the rest of the world. Okay, so it looks like Barack Obama has been trying in his last few months to use his own personal powers, executive orders, appointments, regulations from federal agencies to do an end run around Congress. Whether that will withstand legal challenge, we're not sure about. But he's clearly made climate change in particular one of his legacy issues. Now, speaking of legacy, one area in which I think Obama will be remembered will be healthcare. In fact, you could say that the Affordable Care Act of 2009, which came into law in 2010, is the only major legislative achievement of the Obama presidency. Now, I don't mean to disparage it. It's a big piece of legislation, but it's interesting that there haven't really been any more. Here he is signing it in 2010. Explaining the US healthcare system in just a few minutes is a fool's errand, so let me try that. Unlike virtually every other country in the world that has some version of what the Americans call single payer, so it has a kind of single integrated health system, whether it's for insurance, but there's a single entity in effect. The Americans have a bizarre, crazy, multiplying healthcare system, multiple insurance companies, plans, everything marketized. And the US insurance system is tied to your job. So depending on your job, you will have a different kind of health insurance. So, you know, inequity is kind of built into the process. There's a reason it's that way, which I could talk about, but it dates back to World War II and the 1940s. Anyway, so you qualify for a different health plan depending on your employer. Even if you can get insurance from your employer, it's not necessarily good insurance. It won't cover certain conditions. You may find yourself in a situation where you pay huge charges for certain kinds of treatment. Even the best plans come with the expectation that when you go to the doctor's surgery, you will not just present your insurance card, but also your credit card. Any of you who've actually lived in the US or come from the US will be familiar with the dreaded copay, the little bit of money that you give to the doctor, or often lots of money you give, that supplements your insurance, a kind of deductible. And those numbers, the copay numbers, have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So pretty much everyone, even the people that have healthcare insurance in the United States, have been having issues. But there have been enormous problems in the past 40 or 50 years, particularly with the uninsured. So with people who don't get insurance through their workplace, can't afford it, don't buy it, and who then get sick, which creates all kinds of terrible problems. Now, for decades, liberals and progressives have been arguing that what the US needs is a single-payer system, something like the system in Canada or here in the United Kingdom. The whole system needs to be replaced by this single-payer thing. That's been the argument. Those of you with long memories will remember that Hillary Clinton, back in 1993, during the first months of her husband's administration, was his point person for healthcare reform. So Bill Clinton was going to try and do this. And Hillary was the person he kind of put out front to sell a plan. Hillary didn't sell this single-player kind of NHS-style plan. She sold something that was a bit more friendly to the market, but it didn't end up working out. And so from that time in 1993, no one touched this issue again until 2009. Now, when Obama came in, he decided it would be too difficult to make major changes. So he did not endorse a single-payer system. So many of the problems I just mentioned are very much still with us in this new system. Instead, he opted to do two things: to set up a federally regulated market, so some effort to try to help Americans to buy health insurance and control the premiums. But the other thing, and this is really important, is that he allowed poorer Americans to buy their way into something called Medicaid. And Medicaid is the poor person's health insurance scheme that was introduced back in the 1960s. It's fabulous and important and does all kinds of terrific work, even though it's underfunded. So it's almost like a kind of NHS for people who are on very low incomes, in the same way that there is a similar version for people who are seniors, so people who are over 65. So Obama's plan was to expand the number of poor people that could actually join that Medicaid scheme. Now, we've seen in the past 2 years that these reforms are going to bring millions of Americans into the healthcare system. So millions of Americans who weren't insured now will be insured. So that has to be a good thing. And Obama's critics have complained that he's just been tinkering around the edges, doesn't address the fundamental inequalities, inefficiencies in the US healthcare system. All that's true. But if you're on one of these edges, then his tinkering, I think, has been very welcome. So just to summarize all this domestic stuff, and I'm going to say one or two things about foreign policy, I think Obama will get some credit for his handling of the 2008 economic crisis, but the numbers on inequality and on poverty still look bad. His positions on immigration and climate change have become a little more radical in the last year, but they are still looking precarious, legally or in terms of Congress getting involved. Obamacare, as the Affordable Care Act has become known, is a mixed bag, but he's laid down some kind of marker here. Now, foreign affairs has been another area in which Obama has had a lot of hits and misses. Let me start with the good stuff. In some ways, I think that his decision last year to normalize relations with Cuba is going to be seen as incredibly important. I think that may even be his most lasting positive legacy in foreign affairs. Speaking entirely personally, I'm less enamored with his policies in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Central Asia. He was able finally to draw down the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and that's great in terms of meaning that there are fewer American soldiers who are in harm's way. But Obama has been a pioneer of a new kind of conflict, drone warfare, which has allowed the US to perpetuate the Bush administration's central tenet of foreign relations, which in layman's terms is shoot first and ask questions later. During the 2008 campaign, Obama was devastating in his attack on the so-called Bush doctrine. That's the idea of preventative war, which took hold in the US around the time of the Iraq War of 2003. But I think you could make the case that Barack Obama has simply miniaturized the Bush doctrine. His commanders and his pilots now strike with impunity and without warning across a huge swathe of the world. From down here in Yemen to Somalia, Afghanistan and Pakistan is where this has been most pronounced, but of course over in Iraq and now in Syria. This new form, this miniaturized version of preventative war, I think is in some respects Obama's biggest foreign policy innovation. And I'm not sure, frankly, if it makes us safer. Even if we overlook the hundreds, maybe thousands of civilian casualties, it's really hard to find out what's been going on because this drone war story plays into another of the Obama administration's obsessions, which is secrecy. Secrecy has been at an unprecedented level in this administration. Journalists who've made freedom of information requests asking for the legal opinions which inform these drone strikes, and particularly the drone strikes which have ended up in the killing of American citizens who are protected by the Constitution, have been batted away. So it's been incredibly hard, if there is a kind of liberal rationale, legal rationale here for what's been going on, actually to see it. Most Americans support these strikes, but I think that's hardly surprising since so few of their consequences show up on US TV screens. Unless you subscribe to Al Jazeera, in which case you would see them all the time. And that information disparity between what people see in the Middle East and what people see on US TV is a big part of the problem that we're in right now as a world, I think. But there hasn't been a major terrorist attack, by which I mean a major terrorist attack of the kind we just saw yesterday in the US since 9/11. So that sense that this is somehow working and it's often out of mind is one of the reasons I think why the US public, when it's asked about this question, seems to support it. Now, the Obama administration's obsession with secrecy and surveillance was brought into the open in 2013 by Edward Snowden. And I think that Obama's hardline response to Snowden, who's still living off the charity of Vladimir Putin, tells us something about the limits of Obama's liberal thinking. And then there's Guantanamo, which remains open more than 6 years after Obama had promised it would be closed with more than 100 prisoners. We can talk about that in the question period. This is often presented as something that Obama desperately wants to do and the Republicans desperately don't want, but we can get into that if you want. It remains 6 years after the time when Obama had told us that it would be gone. It still has about 100, 110 prisoners, about half of whom have been cleared for release, which is another story. And then there's the Middle East peace process, or to be more exact, the absence of a Middle East peace process. It seems incredible to say it, but I think you could argue that Barack Obama has been even less successful than George W. Bush, incredibly, in making a difference to the core conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Okay, so I'm kind of bleak, as you can see, on that subject. But where does that leave us if we plug this foreign story into our assessment of Obama's presidency? And here I'll start winding up. Let me offer two ways of thinking about Obama's failures in office or about some of the limits on what he's done. We could call the first one the gridlock thesis. Now, this view would argue that Barack Obama has actually been a radical leader who's faced impossible odds given the nature of the US political system and the particularly harsh nature, the particular partisan nature of the current Republican Party. You may remember, or perhaps now it's too lost in the mist of time, but Obama actually worked really hard to romance the Republicans back in 2009. I mean, he invited a couple to be in his cabinet. He was determined that he would try to bring them into this circle and have them chanting, "Yes, we can," as well. I'm not sure in retrospect if that seems like it was such a good idea. He faced a wave of hostility from Republicans, even moderate Republicans, almost immediately. And I probably don't need to remind you about the rise of the Tea Party, which coincided with the birther movement and some of these other further to the right attacks on Barack Obama. Now, clearly, there's something in this gridlock thesis, as we'll call it. But I think it's too easy to blame this for all of Obama's woes. I've put together here this very crappy diagram attempting to show you what US political gridlock looks like since 1981. It shows you my AV seals. So the blue here refers to the Democrats, the red to the Republicans. If you follow this down, you can see that every president has had to work with either a divided Congress or, in Clinton's case, with a Congress that was dominated by the Republicans throughout virtually all of his time in office. Obama's pattern here is pretty ordinary. I mean, he's had a relatively good time. You get control to begin with, you lose the House, you hold on to the Senate, that continues, and eventually you lose the whole thing as you become less popular. That's not an uncommon pattern. So in terms of the structural features of US politics, clearly, this is just the way it works. You'd have to make a case that there's something particularly heinous about the current generation of Republicans. There may be something in that too. But certainly structurally, you can see from this that Obama, in a way, is dealing with a problem that everyone, Republican and Democrat, deals with when they're in the White House. I think that Obama maybe hasn't made things easier for himself with this kind of bunker mentality. The New York Times writer Jodi Kantor, who's written a very interesting book about the Obamas, points out the president often seems more comfortable when he's traveling outside the United States than when he's actually within the US. He doesn't like Washington either, and yet somehow he is in this kind of bunker dynamic within the White House. I think there's something very odd, and this is something that I guess I haven't heard a lot of people argue, but I think this is true. There's something very odd about the ways in which the presidency seems to have neutralized Barack Obama. So it makes him seem as if he's no longer got the power to do anything, or certainly very few things. And it points such a contrast from those videos I showed you to start with of his beginnings in the job. And I think even other presidents towards the end of their term, there seems to be a particular kind of, visual, kind of deep, neutrality or neutering maybe of Obama during his final years in office. And I want to try and explain that by returning to something I mentioned earlier on, which is this idea of American exceptionalism. Now, Republicans and even conservative Democrats realized back in 2008 that Barack Obama might actually be a bit soft on the subject of American exceptionalism. The Financial Times did this interview with Obama in which they tried to out him as someone who didn't really believe that America was different from every other country. And here's how he replied. I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I suspect that the Brits believe in British exceptionalism, and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. I'm enormously proud of my country and its role in history and the world. Now, this was seen, particularly on the right, but even by some Democrats, as a kind of relativizing of America's specialness. If everyone thinks their nation's special, and the president can't argue that he's from the only nation that's special, this means he doesn't really believe in American exceptionalism. And I think if you actually sat down and had dinner with Barack Obama in 2007, he would have said exceptionalism is, pardon my language, it's a barrel of crap. It's not real. It doesn't reflect the American experience. However, under pressure from people on the campaign trail, I think Obama is pushed into this place where he comes to accept and even embrace this exceptional language. Let me just tell you a quick story on that front. Do you guys remember back in 2007 that Barack Obama did not wear the ubiquitous US flag pin? Many of you will not even have been born at a time when American presidents didn't wear the flag pin. So I'm wary of showing you this. I mean, I think they all look naked somehow. Look, there's no pin. This is now every American politician has to have a giant stars and stripes up here. Back in 2007, Barack Obama didn't wear one, and he was asked about it in October of 2007, and here's what he said. The truth is that right after 9/11, I had a pin. Shortly after 9/11, particularly as we're talking about the Iraq War, that became a substitute for true patriotism, which is speaking out on issues that are important to our national security. I decided I won't wear that pin on my chest. Instead, I'm going to tell the American people what I believe will make this country great, and hopefully that will be a testimony to my patriotism. So he took this on. He really went after the idea that you had to wear a pin, that you had to show that you were dedicated to this idea of symbolic patriotism. And then things changed. I'm not sure what that's doing there. Maybe it's this. I can't resist the idea that scoundrels wherever wear these pins. It says something about you as a politician that you'd take that on. There he is. 2008, that pin appears. April, May of 2008 is the moment that it shows up. From then on, it never disappears. Now, the idea that Obama was somehow a non-conformist, despite the fact he now had a pin, followed him right the way through his first term to his re-election in 2012. Here's what his 2012 opponent, Mitt Romney, had to say about the issue just before the election in 2012. Our president doesn't have the same feelings about American exceptionalism that we do. And I think over the last 3 or 4 years, some people around the world have begun to question that. It doesn't even make sense. Like, why would people around the world question him not being an exceptionalist? What he means is people around the US. So in his second term, Obama stopped trying to duck this question of exceptionalism, and he went back and did what he had done in 2008 back at the convention, in the speech I showed you to start with. He tried to turn exceptionalism to his own purposes, to find a way to harness its power and subvert its more conservative implications. So in 2014, he declared, not on the fence here, I believe in American exceptionalism with every fiber of my being. But then he qualified this with a quick follow-up. What makes us exceptional is not our ability to flout international norms and the rule of law. It's our willingness to affirm them through our actions. So the US is exceptional because it feels a strong sense of mission to enforce international laws, seek multilateral solutions to the world problems, and so on. Now, this was music to the ears of Republicans, and actually this whole thing is back right now in the presidential campaign on the Republican side. According to the Florida Senator Marco Rubio, in a speech delivered earlier this year, the president has, quote, demonstrated a disregard for our moral purpose that at times flirted with disdain. We'll move on to my favorite candidate, I mean favorite in a very special sense, Bobby Jindal of Louisiana. Here's what he said in February. There's a greater problem here. This is a president who won't proudly proclaim American exceptionalism. Maybe the first president ever who truly doesn't believe in that. Look at his foreign policy. He doesn't see America as a force for good. And I think this gets to the heart of Obama's problem. He knows that the United States can learn from other countries. He knows the US is viewed much more positively by the rest of the world when it makes some effort to obey international law or to work with its partners. But this might require him to go further than he was willing to go on the campaign trail in 2008, to argue that exceptionalism creates more problems than it solves in American politics and in American foreign affairs. And I think that Obama's rather tortured position on exceptionalism is part of this process by which the presidency seems slowly to have neutralized him. I just want to show you one last film. We're nearly done, but one last film that I think makes this point very elegantly, and it's on a domestic issue, the subject of school shootings, which, as you know, is a phenomenon that's been horribly ubiquitous throughout Obama's presidency. We'll just watch a minute or so of this.
There's been another mass shooting in America, this time in a community college in Oregon. That means there are more American families, moms, dads, children, whose lives have been changed forever. That means there's another community stunned with grief, and communities across the country forced to relieve their own anguish, and parents across the country who are scared because they know it might have been their families or their children. I've been to Roseburg, Oregon. There are really good people there. I want to thank all the first responders whose bravery likely saved some lives today. Federal law enforcement has been on the scene in a supporting role, and we've offered to stay and help as much as Roseburg needs for as long as they need. In the coming days, we'll learn about the victims, young men and women who were studying and learning and working hard, their eyes set on the future, their dreams on what they could make of their lives. And America will wrap everyone who's grieving with our prayers and our love. But as I said just a few months ago, and I said a few months before that, and I said each time we see one of these mass shootings, our thoughts and prayers are not enough. It's not enough. It does not capture the heartache and grief and anger that we should feel. And it does nothing to prevent this carnage from being inflicted someplace else in America. Next week, or a couple of months from now. We don't yet know why this individual did what he did. And it's fair to say that anybody who does this has a sickness in their minds, regardless of what they think their motivations may be. But we are not the only country on earth that has people with mental illnesses or want to do harm to other people. We are the only advanced country on earth that sees these kinds of mass shootings every few months. Earlier this year, I answered a question in an interview by saying, the United States of America is the one advanced nation on earth in which we do not have sufficient common sense gun safety laws, even in the face of repeated mass killings. And later that day, there was a mass shooting at a movie theater in Lafayette, Louisiana. That day. Somehow this has become routine. The reporting is routine. My response here at this podium ends up being routine. The conversation in the aftermath of it, we've become numb to this. We talked about this after Columbine and Blacksburg, after Tucson, after Newtown, after Aurora, after Charleston. It cannot be this easy for somebody who wants to inflict harm on other people to get his or her hands on a gun.
Okay, this goes on for another 10 minutes, but this argument that America is different does not apply or should not apply to guns I think is incredibly powerfully stated there. And of course, the response from the right has been, America's different. So in some respects, if you want to make a change here, you need to have this fight in a way that I think rhetorically, in terms of the construction of his political personality, it's been incredibly hard for Barack Obama to do from day one. Okay, well, to conclude, could the president have gone further with his agenda if he'd been more honest from the beginning about American exceptionalism? If he'd share with the American public the fact that the stories they told themselves about what made them different had actually become a kind of straitjacket on American politics and American life. That would have been a tall order back in 2008 for sure. But then the problem with Obama was that he made people believe that anything was possible. Now, you may remember from the blurb advertising this event that I promised to give you some idea of how historians might view Obama. Now, I found out in the process of writing the lecture, this has actually already happened. You can go off and find it in New York Magazine. 53 historians, all of them considerably more distinguished than me, are giving you their view in considerably less time. So actually, I recommend this if you can stand any more of this after the event. Now, some of these assessments are enthusiastic. Plenty of them blame the gridlock thesis I mentioned before for Obama's difficulties in office. But I was struck by the words, and I'll call them very harsh words, of a historian called Samuel Moyne, who's at Harvard. Here's what he said. I'll put it on the screen. Obama's primary legacy is his destruction of political idealism for the foreseeable future. The truth is, we'll never know what would have happened if Obama, on the strength of his first electoral victory, had tried to live up to the hype. We do know that the energies he conjured will not reappear soon, and are less likely to do so because he summoned them for so ordinary and predictable a set of policies. Now, I think it might be unfair to hold Obama to account in this way, because for this campaigner, political idealism was first and foremost a style. He had an incredible ability to encourage people to invest their hopes and their ideals in the promise of his candidacy. But this skill, this style, which I think was rooted in his incredible fusion of exceptionalism and the black political protest tradition, will leave historians with one enduring question. To what extent is Obama now responsible for the fact that so many people who once said, yes, we can, now say, no, we can't? Thank you very much, everyone.
Nick, thank you very much indeed for a marvellous lecture. We've got about a quarter of an hour or so for questions, and there's a roving mic which Liz will hold up. And so there's a question over here, Liz.
There we go. Don't you think you have to adopt the gridlock theory to Barack Obama? You can't say that he faced gridlock like all those other people. When he was the first black president to suddenly face a completely new kind of gridlock, where you had people fighting demons that they didn't even know they had. And I find that historian's comment so sad in a way, and I find it so sad what Obama faced after he was elected, because all of us did think that if he was elected, anything was possible. And what was unleashed was just as powerful as the wave that brought him in. And I've never seen such a terrible and disastrous crash of values in my life. And I don't think it's fair to say that all those other presidents faced gridlock, because they didn't face anything like what he faced.
I mean, I think that's a completely legitimate point of view. I don't share it entirely, but I do share it partly. I'm not trying to suggest that this gridlock thesis versus my arguments about exceptionalism is a choice between either or. I mean, you have to accept the fact that something important, something major happened in the past 7 years in regard to the Republicans acting against him. I do think two things. One, I think that having lived through the 1990s in the US, the idea that this species of Republicans is qualitatively different from Bill Clinton's species of Republicans is not true. And I think that Obama's fate has been rather different from Bill Clinton's fate. But I think I would also say, and again, this is the corduroy-jacketed person speaking, and I'm absolutely vulnerable to that charge. I think some of the decisions he made in his first year about trying to find a middle ground on which he could meet Republicans were a mistake. Because I think what he needed to do was harness the energy of the people who'd supported him and turn it on those people, and turn it on those arguments the Republicans brought to bear straight away. I think he is, by temperament, a centrist. And I think this is a moment for a radical. And I think in that sense, the radicals who gathered behind him in 2008 weren't by his side when he was bringing Republicans into the cabinet and trying to look for the center ground that they would never give him. So that's a tactical problem, but I think it was a major mistake.
Well, I do. I think it's a combination, because I think that he couldn't be a radical because everybody said, you're not one of us. Blacks said, you're not one of us. You're not being the radical leader that's making all of our policies. And whites said, you're not one of us. And so that's what I mean by a different kind of gridlock. He faced it completely. And I think the whole theory that he didn't believe in exceptionalism was a complete diversion about you're not one of us. And that's what both sides were saying about him from the moment he swore the oath of office.
Thanks.
There's one over here. Yeah, thank you. Order as they come up.
Thank you so much for the very enlightening discussion and lecture. I'm going back to that first year. I'm trying to also understand how you think that he realistically could have done things differently, because from my recollection, all of what you said is absolutely correct, and the critical sort of event right at the beginning was the passage of this Healthcare Act, which had been too radical for any other prior Democratic president to pass, including, as you said, Hillary Clinton under Bill Clinton at the height of sort of his popularity. That then, the response to that was the Tea Party. The Tea Party was a response to the initial sort of rollout of the Healthcare Act. And so I myself, just to give a little historical context, so obviously I grew up in the US, and I'm from Southwest Florida, which is very Republican and not necessarily as naive as some of the rest of the sort of Tea Party arena. And then I lived in California and New York, and so I see everybody sort of viewpoints coming together on social media. And so that realistically, so let's play out. What do you think would have happened if he had been even more radical in that first year?
Well, there are two ways of looking at this. One of them is you can say that he could have been much more radical and he wasn't. The other is that he could never have been radical, in which case the radical rhetoric on the campaign trail was always going to present this sense of betrayal, right? So, I mean, either we can agree on one or the other. I mean, for my money, crises open up moments. We know this in American history where real change can take place. I don't think that in that moment of crisis, Obama's instinct was to say, if you're not with me on this, lots of people are, and we're going to push ahead with this. His instinct was to say, let's bring everyone in here. And I understand that because he's a rational guy. And unfortunately, the truth-based community in US politics has kind of gotten rather partisan in recent years. I mean, I don't want to nail my colors to the mast, but very, very often I think many of the leading Republican contenders have wandered away from that truth-based community. And to try and bring them back in your first year as a priority when you control Congress, to me, may have been a mistake. I do want to say one tiny thing about the Tea Party, which is it was not created by the healthcare reform debate. I was actually at the Ron Paul convention, where you had to pay $17.76 to attend during the Republican convention in Minneapolis in the autumn of 2008. And I can tell you, it was a scary, scary event. And many of those people were as estranged from George W. Bush as they would ever be from Barack Obama. So I'm happy to talk about that, but that's not a Republican Party rejection of Barack Obama. It plugs into libertarian, anti-government feeling that actually both Republicans and Democrats have struggled to contain. So.
Next one's down here. Could I ask you to try and keep questions quite brief now, because we haven't got very much longer left. So one, the lady just down here in the green cardigan.
It's a very quick question. Do you think he faced a lot of opposition from his own party, especially when he was trying to bring in the healthcare bill that slowed down his progress?
But there's a whole bunch of other problems in American politics, one of which is that a lot of the Democratic Party is relatively conservative by European standards, and that every politician, I think, is extremely sensitive to the interests of big money. I didn't even mention the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which has effectively waved in a whole new rush of money into US politics. And that creates massive problems. I mean, to talk about the reason why there isn't meaningful single-payer healthcare in the US, it's because, in my view, it's absolutely impossible to push that through given the amount of lobbying by the huge number of interests in the current crazy healthcare system that you have there. So yeah, I think there's opposition from his own party, but there's also opposition from money in politics, which we are further away from solving in the US now than we were even in 2009. That's not really his fault per se, but we're further away from solving it than we were. So.
There's one at the back there. I think we've probably got time for two more.
Thank you. Who is to blame for the persistence of Guantanamo?
Oh, well, maybe we should talk about that over tea. If you're going to come for tea, I'd be happy to talk about it. I mean, there is a view that, to do it very quickly, there is a view that the Republicans have been blocking this, which is completely correct, that the Republicans have effectively created a kind of legislative firewall around this. The question is whether that's actually something the President loses much sleep over. And apart from the embarrassment of us being so far down the line now from the time he promised it would close, the major advantage to the President of not closing Guantanamo is that those people aren't spilled into the US prison system, which means they have access to the US legal system. And that's something that people on both sides of American politics are very nervous about. So.
Okay, yeah. One at the back here, Kai at the back. Sorry if you can get there, Liz.
You're making Liz work here, Jeremy.
I know.
Sending her all over.
Just this.
We need to work in quadrants here.
Last one, Kai, and then one.
I just have a question in relation to your explanation of Obama's foreign policy. You didn't mention anything about the deal that was struck with Iran, nor did you mention anything about the pivot to Asia, nor do I think that you mentioned Obama's policy of non-intervention in Middle East conflicts. And if you actually take these three things into consideration, couldn't you make the argument that Obama's foreign policy could be qualified as being relatively successful and quite innovative from his predecessors?
I agree. I admitted many things. I'm going to take yours as perhaps the single vote for the second hour of the lecture, which we could now move on to. Iran, yes. Non-intervention, no. Pivot to Asia, I think, is nuts. I'm not sure what it is, and I'm not sure what it's done. So.
Okay. One more. And this lady here. That's it. And that's it.
Can you say, again on the list of emissions, but you touched briefly on sort of inequality. You also touched on secrecy. Can you say something about Obama's relationship with technology and big technology?
Yeah, a little. I mean, Obama found himself in a very difficult situation for, I think, an instinct that was a very good one, which is to try and help the Solyndra Corporation, which is a manufacturer of solar panels in New England, which was part of his commitment to try to fund renewable energy. And partly because of Chinese dumping of solar panels into the US, the firm went bust, and Obama found himself on the end of all kinds of criticism for state intervention and the crony capitalism or whatever. I mean, it's crony green capitalism, if it was even crony capitalism, which it probably wasn't. But I think that created big problems for him. And otherwise, there are plenty of people in Silicon Valley, I think, whose relationship with Obama is very good. I'm thinking about Elon Musk.
But too good. I mean, this is what I.
What do you mean by too? What do you mean by too good?
Well, I mean, part of the idealism was also coming into one of the areas, reduced inequality, and some of the graphs he was showing. I mean, that was Connecticut, that wasn't Silicon Valley. But if you'd included Silicon Valley, it would have been, the similar sort of. Right. So I mean.
Well, here's a funny thing. If I can just, so you put your finger on it. There's just a piece, I think, in the Washington Post 3 days ago saying the Democrats in this campaign season are talking about economic inequality. And Bernie Sanders, we haven't talked about, but Bernie Sanders is talking about this all the time. Hillary is talking about it, which is more incredible. But Bernie Sanders is making this a big deal. The Washington Post talks about how inequality is worse in the 6 states that are controlled by Democrats and that vote Democratic. So it raises some interesting questions about how we solve this problem in the current political system. So.
Lots of unanswered questions this afternoon. It'll have to remain like that, I'm afraid. There's tea downstairs for those who booked in for tea. But thank you very much for coming. Can we show our appreciation to Nick again? Thank you.